commence with the daily routine, presenting and reading petitions. The Honourable the Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table a petition. The operative clause state, we the undersigned support the immediate installation of traffic lights at the intersection of Glendale Drive and Estates Road in Lower Sackville, and urge the Government of Nova Scotia to take appropriate steps to ensure the safety of drivers who use this dangerous roadway. Mr. Speaker, this is signed by employees and customers of many businesses, totaling 841, and I too have fixed my signature.
The petition is tabled. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Boston Common is aglow with Christmas cheer now that the city has lit the 50-foot white spruce donated by Nova Scotia for this annual gift-giving tradition to thank Bostonians for their generosity 90 years ago as a result of the Halifax explosion. And whereas the thousands attending this year's lighting ceremony were entertained by talented Nova Scotians like the McGilvery family, Maddie Rankin, Christiane Theriault, and Scott Long. And whereas the event highlights the strong personal and economic connection between our citizens, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House thank the people of Boston for continuing this grand tradition and hope that the prominent novascotia.com sign encourages many of our neighbours to discover our beautiful province. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Canada's most powerful women, Top 100 list by Women's Executive Network, recognizes leadership and achievements of women in the Canadian workplace. And whereas Cheryl Dorian, Nova Scotia's Deputy Minister of Health, was honoured with the Public Sector Award given to women who occupy the most senior positions in government department and manage significant operating budgets. And whereas Ms. Dorian was one of only 12 women recognized under this category, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House join me in congratulating Ms. Dorian, our Deputy Minister Dorian, on this well-deserved award and thank her for her dedication and commitment to the public service. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the farmers of this province work hard year-round to provide us with healthy and safe food, and whereas this fine group of women and men meet once a year to conduct business, participate in discussion, present awards of recognition, and to socialize, and whereas the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture will hold its annual meeting in Truro today and tomorrow, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House wish the producers, the farmers of this province, an excellent annual meeting and best wishes for their future. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Natural Resources.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Minerals Association in Nova Scotia succeeds the former Chamber of Mineral Resources in representing more than 150 members from all areas of this province's mining sector, including those involved in exploration, discovery, development, production, and reclamation. And whereas the association works with government and other parallel organizations to provide a framework and educate Nova Scotians on the value of this industry to society and the economic well-being of the province. And whereas the organization's first executive director is Michelle Landreville, who brings broad experience in both public and private sectors to bear on the challenges facing the association and industry. Therefore be it resolved that members of this House recognize the Minerals Association in Nova Scotia and the appointment of its first executive director as a positive step in ensuring the continued success of this important economic generator to the province. Mr. Speaker, I request a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in the spirit of keeping Nova Scotia green, the new Citadel High School in Halifax was constructed with the latest in energy-saving innovation. Whereas the facility's design was fostered through an architectural competition to encourage cutting-edge ideas and creative design. And whereas Citadel High School opened this fall and is serving 1,400 students in the Halifax area. Therefore, be resolved, all members of this House congratulate the designers Fowler, Bald, and Mitchell, the contractor Pomerleau Construction, Department of Education, and the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal for this welcome addition to the Nova Scotia school system. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and pass without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Abco Industries Limited, based out of Lunenburg, is manufacturing state-of-the-art vessels for the island of Tobago to patrol 2 protected wilderness islands. And whereas Abco's marine vessels have been servicing the needs of the marine industry here and abroad for over 50 years. And whereas in addition their design and fabrication of equipment for water treatment, solid waste recycling and composting is helping Nova Scotia and the rest of the world achieve their environmental goals. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House join the people of Nova Scotia in congratulating Abco Limited for their world-class products, their commitment to their community, and their work on developing solid waste technology that can be used throughout the world. I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Community Services.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Department of Community Services staff continue to build awareness and encourage Nova Scotians to consider adopting a child who needs a permanent, loving home of their own, and whereas more than 100 children and youth in Nova Scotia who are waiting to be adopted into a loving home, and whereas the act of adoption is one of selfless commitment to improving the life of a young person, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House commend the adoptive families who have taken the step in welcoming a child into their home, be it this year or years past, and encourage Nova Scotians to consider adopting a young person in permanent care into their families and hearts forever. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister responsible for Emergency Management.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas newcomers to Canada and Nova Scotia in particular are often not familiar with weather-related emergencies, and whereas it is important for all residents to understand the need to be prepared for the first 72 hours in any emergency, and whereas the Metropolitan Immigrant Settlement Association recently hosted a presentation by EMO Nova Scotia to teach basic emergency planning to more than 50 new Nova Scotians. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House acknowledge the efforts made by MESA to help new Nova Scotians understand the need for emergency preparedness in their new homes. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that in a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Mining Matters is an annual conference that focuses attention on the exploration, discovery, development, production, reclamation, and other geoscience work being undertaken in this province. And whereas this year's conference included an investors forum that provided participants with an opportunity to review and better understand some of the escalating levels of exploration and production taking place in Nova Scotia and right across the Atlantic provinces. And whereas the Mining Matters 2007 and Industry and Investment Forum attracted record numbers of participants from right across the country. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House acknowledge the outstanding role that public and private sector partners in mining matters played in helping to better inform Nova Scotians about the modern minerals industry. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas government and the trucking industry are working together to make maritime highways safer for all, and whereas vehicle inspectors, safety officers, and mechanics from all three maritime provinces were on hand at Kelly Lake Vehicle Inspection Station on Highway 102 in August to provide free braking checks and adjustments for trucks and information about the National Safety Code. And whereas by working together with trucking industry, government can help truckers spot potential problems before they occur. Therefore, be resolved, all members of this House recognize the efforts of the Provincial Vehicle Compliance Officers, Safety Officers, the Atlantic Provinces Trucking Association, the Nova Scotia Trucking Human Resource Sector Council, the Nova Scotia Trucking Safety Association, and mechanics from McKay's Truck and Trailer Centre of Truro and Pentagon Limited of St. John's, Newfoundland for making provincial roads safer for all motorists. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia Power, Point Coney, Michelin Bridgewater, Oxford Frozen Foods, Nina Paper, Canadian Salt Mine, Crown Fibre, and Reinforced Plastics are working with their staff to create a strong health and safety culture. And whereas their management teams and members of their Joint Occupational Health and Safety Committee presented valuable information to me during a summer tour I conducted that can help create a strong health and safety culture in other workplaces in Nova Scotia. And whereas their efforts are going a long way in creating an accident and injury-free Nova Scotia. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House join the people of Nova Scotia in congratulating all the staff at Nova Scotia Power Point Coney, Michelin Bridgewater, Oxford Frozen Foods, Nina Paper, Canadian Salt Mine, Crown Fibre, and Reinforced Plastics for their assistance in educating, promoting, and creating awareness of the importance of health and safety in the workplace. I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister responsible for EMO.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia municipalities work to promote the importance of emergency preparedness, and whereas the municipality of Guysborough County took the message to the streets with their municipal parade float, and whereas they participated in numerous parades over the summer months distributing emergency preparedness literature and items, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House acknowledge the efforts made by the municipality of Guysborough in promoting public safety. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Human Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Provincial Civil Service depends on skilled professionals and tradespeople to provide a range of important programs and services to Nova Scotians. And whereas it is often seasonal workers, casual employees, and students who are at the front lines, working in our provincial parks and forests within the tourism industry and throughout the province in various government offices. And whereas without these workers, Nova Scotians and visitors could not enjoy some of this province's most important seasonal offerings. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House acknowledge the importance of seasonal and casual workers and the role that they have in the delivery of high-quality public service to our citizens. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 69 of the Acts of 1992, the Nova Scotia Provincial Exhibition Commission Act.
The honourable member begs leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 69 of the Acts of 1992, the Nova Scotia Provincial Exhibition Commission Act.
Bill 46, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 69 of the Acts of 1992, the Nova Scotia Provincial Exhibition Commission Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statute 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Bill 47, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Repeal Chapter 11 of the Acts of 2005, the Petroleum Products Pricing Act.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Repeal Chapter 11 of the Acts of 2005, the Petroleum Products Pricing Act.
Bill 50, entitled An Act to Repeal Chapter 11 of the Acts of 2005, the Petroleum Products Pricing Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Minister of Human Resources.
Mr. Speaker, if you'd allow me to do an introduction before I introduce the bill.
Please do.
In the East Gallery, we have Joan Jessam, President of the NSGEU, Linda Power, Executive Director of the NSGEU, Karen Tompkins, Director of Negotiations, Ian Johnson, Coordinator of Policy and Education, Robin McLean, Servicing Coordinator for the NSGEU, and I'd like to acknowledge their presence here and ask for a warm welcome of the House. And I'd also like to thank them for their cooperation on this bill. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 71 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Civil Service Collective Bargaining Act.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 71 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Civil Service Collective Bargaining Act.
Bill 51, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 71 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Civil Service Collective Bargaining Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 27 of the Acts of 2000, the Employment Support and Income Assistance Act.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 27 of the Acts of 2000, the Employment Support and Income Assistance Act.
Bill 52, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 27 of the Acts of 2000, the Employment Support and Income Assistance Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to enter a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act.
Bill 53, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and my capacity as Acting Minister responsible for the Credit Union Act, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 4 of the Acts of 1994, the Credit Union Act.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 4 of the Acts of 1994, the Credit Union Act.
Bill 52, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 4 of the Acts of 1994, the Credit Union Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Member for Halifax Citadel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Bill 53, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 6 of the Acts of 1994-1995, the Maintenance Enforcement Act.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 6 of the Acts of 1994-95, the Maintenance Enforcement Act.
Bill 54, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 6 of the Acts of 1994-95, the Maintenance Enforcement Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm rising in my capacity as the Acting Minister of Finance, and I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 377 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Service Superannuation Act.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 377 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Service Superannuation Act.
Bill 55, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 377 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Service Superannuation Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The Honourable the Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas our healthcare professionals across Nova Scotia deliver quality care under often challenging circumstances, and whereas the staff of the third floor medical inpatient unit at the Yarmouth Regional Hospital are no exception, and whereas these hard-working staff are ready and willing to give excellent care to patients requiring a hospital stay at the Yarmouth Regional Hospital, therefore be it resolved that the House of Assembly congratulate and thank the dedicated health providers of the third floor medical inpatient unit of the Yarmouth Regional Hospital and all health providers and allied professionals in this province, Mr. Speaker. I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Mr. Speaker, hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Most Reverend Anthony...
Order, please. We're having a little trouble hearing the Speaker.
Whereas the Most Reverend Anthony Mancini, an Auxiliary Bishop of Montreal, Quebec, has come to Halifax to serve as Archbishop of the Archdiocese of Halifax. And whereas on November 29, 2007, the Most Reverend Anthony Mancini was installed as the 12th Archbishop of Halifax at a ceremony at St. Mary's Cathedral Basilica, and whereas over 30 bishops and 100 priests and 30 deacons from across the country, as well as many laity, were in attendance at this solemn event, presided over by the Pope's Canadian representative, Archbishop Ventura, therefore be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly wish the Most Reverend Anthony Mancini all the best in his duties as the 12th Archbishop of Halifax. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Falmouth resident Larry Gibbons has been recognized this year for his dedication and commitment to the Scouting movement, and whereas 2007 marks the centennial year for the Scouting movement in Canada, and as a result, a medal has been created to commemorate the past 100 years and to celebrate the beginning of the next 100 years of Scouting in Canada. And whereas Larry Gibbons is one of the Nova Scotia volunteers to receive this Scouts Canada commemorative centennial medal, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Larry Gibbons, who has truly made a significant contribution to Scouting and the volunteering of his time for an exceptionally worthwhile group of individuals. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 31st Royal Canadian Legion Track and Field Championships were held in Ormocto, New Brunswick this past summer, and whereas Cameron Vino of Caledonia ran a lifetime personal best in the 100-meter final to finish fourth, and a lifetime personal best in the 200-meter final. And whereas Cameron is the only athlete in Canada to have finished in the top 4 in this event for the past 3 years. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognize Cameron Vino of Caledonia on his accomplishments at the Nationals and congratulate Cameron for having been named to the core team for the 2009 Nova Scotia Canada Games team. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas each year Nova Scotia sends a Christmas tree to the people of Boston, Massachusetts as a symbol of appreciation for their help in the aftermath of the Halifax explosion, and whereas this year's tree is a 14-meter white spruce, which was generously donated by Christopher and Lisa Hamilton of Granville Center, Annapolis County, and whereas the tree was cut on November 14th and was lit in a tree lighting ceremony in Boston on November 29th, therefore be it resolved that members of this House of Assembly recognize the significance of the Boston Christmas tree and thank Christopher and Lisa Hamilton for donating such a beautiful tree. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, hereby I give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Sobeys Chief Operating Officer, Jenna Sobey, has been pleased to be part of the historic family business for the last 5 years. Whereas the daughter of John Robert and Gail Sobey, Jenna has lived and studied all over the world, but she's happy to call Stellarton home again, where she lives with her husband, who is Sobey's Chief Chef Advisor, and their 3 children. And whereas Ms. Sobey has enjoyed working on the 100th anniversary project and has learned a great deal about her family and ancestors and is looking forward to traveling to the 81 Sobey stores across Canada to help introduce specialized marketing plans. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House send their best wishes to Jenna Sobey as she leaves her mark on the historic grocery business and passes on the values of hard work and community support to her children as they were passed to her, demonstrating some of the qualities that make Nova Scotia business such a success. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas each year the Coast newspaper publishes a Best of Halifax listing in which readers vote for their favorite people, places, and things. And whereas the 2007 poll was published on November 15th, including the categories of Best Member of the Legislative Assembly. And whereas the Honourable Member for Halifax Needham was the winner of the Best MLA, and Honourable Members for Halifax Citadel and Halifax Chebucto achieved first and second runner-up respectively, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate the Honourable Members of Halifax Needham, Halifax Citadel, and Halifax Chebucto for this recognition, and thank the Coast for giving its readers a chance to cast their votes outside of Election Day. And Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on November 3rd, 2007, the Premier held a forum on student achievement, and whereas invitations to attend this forum were sent out to school advisory council chairs, but neglected to invite other parent-school partnership organizations such as Home and School, parent-teacher associations, and PTSAs. And whereas in schools where there is no functioning school advisory council, there are the type of groups that provide essential advice to the school community. Therefore, be it resolved that the Premier investigate why these important representatives were not invited to the Premier's Forum on Student Achievement and ensure that they will be included in future events. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable, the Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I read my resolution, I wonder if I might be permitted to make an introduction.
Please do.
Mr. Speaker, in your gallery this morning there are 3 residents of Cape Breton West. I'm sure you might be familiar with them. I'd like to introduce Ed Nadelsky, Anthony Nadelsky, and Anthony Nadelsky Jr., and I would ask that they please rise and receive the warm welcome of the House. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the North Shore and District Volunteer Fire Department was founded March 12, 1962, and whereas the North Shore and District Volunteer Fire Department held a special ceremony in late June celebrating this important 45-year milestone and anniversary, and whereas the North Shore and District Volunteer Fire Department has 25 members and is home to 3 pumper trucks and a tanker, and are now working on raising funds to purchase a brand new truck in 2012, marking their 50th year of operation. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly applaud Chief Merrill McGuinness and the North Shore and District Volunteer Fire Department on their 45th anniversary and thank its members, both past and present, for their dedication and commitment to their community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I may be permitted, I'd like to make an introduction.
Please do.
I'd like to draw the attention of the House to the West Gallery, where I'm joined today by one of my constituents, Mr. Ray Lafrane, who has brought great pride to this province in 10 years of competition in the National Snow Sculpture competitions. We can join in giving him a round of applause. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in February of 2007, competitors from all of Canada's provinces and territories gathered in the nation's capital region to participate in the National Snow Sculpture Competition. And whereas this competition tests the physical ability and brings out the artistry and talent of the competitors by turning a 60-ton, 2-story high block of snow into an amazing work of art. And whereas the Nova Scotia team composed of Ray Lafrane, Nigel Manny, and Gordon Richardson proudly represented their province and stood out from the rest of the competitors by taking silver in this year's event. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate the Nova Scotia team of Ray Laframe, Nigel Manny, and Gordon Richardson for winning second place at the 2007 National Snow Sculpture Competition. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas there are over 39.5 million people living with HIV worldwide, whereas on December the 1st, 1988, World AIDS Day was created to help raise money, increase awareness, fight prejudice, and improve education on this disease. And whereas the 2007 theme, Leadership, highlights the need for innovation, vision, perseverance in the face of AIDS challenge, with a campaign calling on all sectors of society, such as families, communities, civil society organizations, to take the initiative and provide leadership on AIDS. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly appeal to all levels of government, policymakers, regional health authorities to ensure that they meet the many targets that have been set in the fight against HIV and AIDS. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Immigration.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Bedford Days is now a 30-year tradition in Bedford of promoting community and family fun, and whereas Bedford Days 2007 drew record crowds, the festival synonymous with incredible fireworks displays and creative events. Whereas the members of the 2007 Bedford Days Committee ensured success of this year's festival, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House extend their congratulations to the 2007 Bedford Days Committee for their dedication to continuing this community tradition in Bedford. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Halifax Citadel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas King George III granted 235 acres of land for the use of the inhabitants of the town of Halifax forever in 1763, and whereas less than 1/3 of this land is still open for use by the general population of Halifax, and whereas the Friends of the Halifax Common is an organization dedicated to campaigning to reclaim, preserve, and protect the common lands, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly affirm the need for Halifax Common to be preserved as common land and applaud the work done by the Friends of the Halifax Common to that end. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Richmond.
Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas each holiday season, CTV holds their annual Christmas Mummies and Daddies telethon on the first weekend in December. And whereas the mandate of the telethon is to provide less fortunate children with gifts at Christmas, including toys, gifts, and clothing. Whereas to date, CTV's Christmas Mummies and Daddies telethon has raised over $24 million for less fortunate families in the Maritimes. Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly recognize the many volunteers who donate their time to the telethon and encourage all Nova Scotians to give generously to this worthwhile cause. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. We'll move on to orders of the day. We'll revert back to the resolutions. The Honourable the Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Health Canada ranks walking as one of the most popular activities Canadians can choose to keep active, and trails in Nova Scotia are vital to the health and well-being of our citizens. And whereas Jim Tudor is a driving force behind the Cole Harbour Parks and Trails Association, an association that has been instrumental in the development of the Salt Marsh Trail and the Shearwater Flyer, both part of the Rails to Trails program. And whereas Cole Harbour Parks and Trails Association is continuing on the development of the Shearwater Flyer connection to the Dartmouth Harbour Trail, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly thank and commend Jim Tudor and the Cole Harbour Parks and Trails Association for their ongoing efforts in trail development in the Cole Harbour and Eastern Passage area. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Government Deputy House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Bill number 11, the Civil Forfeiture Act.
Bill number 11. The Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am presenting this bill on behalf of the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased today to rise on second reading of Bill number 11, the Civil Forfeiture Act. Mr. Speaker, civil forfeiture can be an important remedial tool in the criminal justice system. It ensures that wrongful property gains do not remain in the hands of a wrongdoer. In other words, Mr. Speaker, it creates a process that allows the province to order the forfeiture of properties used to commit crimes or the forfeiture of assets gained from unlawful activities. Mr. Speaker, this legislation will allow us to hit criminals where it hurts the most, their wallets. Specifically, it will create a civil process through the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia for the forfeiture of property acquired through unlawful activities and property used to engage in unlawful activity. This new bill is the latest in a series of new laws and initiatives introduced to fight crime and protect the safety and security of Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, we have also put in place the Safer Communities and Neighbourhoods Act, which has shut down more than 20 illegal drug houses. We have created new youth programming and supervision, introduced electronic monitoring of offenders, and are adding 250 new police officers over 4 years. The federal government also recently responded to Nova Scotia's call to strengthen the Youth Criminal Justice Act by introducing amendments that give the court more flexibility to hold a young person before trial if their behavior is dangerous. This is another important tool to send the message that crime doesn't pay in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the support of the other parties with regards to these amendments, and on that, I move second reading of Bill number 11.
The Honourable the Member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This really is an extraordinary piece of legislation, and I do want to take some time today to speak about it because, Mr. Speaker, there is no question that this bill is going to be challenged in court on constitutional and other grounds. And I think it's important that we here in this House on second reading put on the record the purpose of the bill and our concerns about the bill. Because the courts will look at what is said in this House, and I hope that perhaps on third reading, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice will be able to stand up in the House and put on the record at greater length the purposes of the government in proposing this legislation. Let me get out of the way, Mr. Speaker, one point, which I want to say right off the top so that nobody misunderstands where we're coming from in this, and that is that we will support the bill on second reading, because the purpose of the bill is stated to be to provide civil remedies that will assist in preventing persons who engage in unlawful activities and others from keeping property that was acquired as a result of unlawful activity and preventing property from being used to engage in unlawful activity. Obviously a good purpose, and one which we support. So the bill, in principle, is one that we support. We also note that other provinces in Canada have it. Nova Scotia is not the first province proposing to have such legislation. But there are important differences between what is being proposed here in Nova Scotia and what is being done in other provinces. And I would like to, later in my remarks, I would like to sketch what some of those differences are and query the government about why it is that there are these very significant differences between what's being done in other provinces and what's being proposed here in Nova Scotia. I would also like to point out to the House that there are already proceeds of crime legislation on the books and available through the criminal code. The most notable example here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, was when the Hells Angel Clubhouse on Dutch Village Road in my constituency was shut down and the assets seized and sold so that that criminal organization would no longer have a foothold in the city or the province. And so we already know that we have legislation that is capable of doing these things. So what this legislation does is above and beyond the tools that are already available and already being used by police forces here in Nova Scotia and indeed across the country. Let me then, Mr. Speaker, illustrate what it is that this bill does. What this bill is intended to do is to keep criminals from profiting from their crimes. Nobody could possibly argue with that. As the Minister of Transportation has just said, what the government wants to do with this bill is hit criminals in their wallet, which is a very important way of fighting crime. So let me give an example of how this works in practice. This is an actual case from Ontario called the Chatterjee case, which went all the way to the Ontario Court of Appeal. And Mr. Chatterjee was pulled over by the police, who discovered in his trunk $29,000 in cash, plus a few lights and other electrical equipment that is typically used for hydroponic marijuana growing operations. And in addition to finding this equipment and the $29,000 in cash, everything smelled very strongly of marijuana. Now, Mr. Speaker, the police could not charge Mr. Chatterjee with any crime because all they found was this evidence that a crime may have been committed or had probably been committed, but they didn't actually have the hydroponic growing operation. They never found where this growing operation was. So what they did, so they didn't have the evidence on which to charge him with a crime. So what they did was they seized the money, they seized the equipment, and Mr. Chatterjee challenged the seizure all the way up to the Ontario Court of Appeal. Now, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I don't have a great deal of sympathy for Mr. Chatterjee, who ended up losing his case, because he was never able to provide any kind of a sensible explanation of where the money came from or why it smelled so strongly of marijuana. And so that is the kind of situation that this bill is designed to get at, where in the circumstances there is no criminal charge and can be no criminal charge, but it is very, very likely indeed that a crime has been committed, and we don't want criminals to profit from their crime. So that's an example of what this bill is intended to do. So what is the problem that could possibly arise with a bill like this? Well, the analogy I would use, Mr. Speaker, is this is like a bill designed to get sharks out of the ocean. Let's suppose that we have deemed sharks to be an evil fish, and we want to do everything we can to get the sharks out of the ocean. So we pass a law, but what the law does is it makes it so easy and straightforward to catch sharks, and the nets used to catch them are so small that it sweeps up a lot of other fish and sea life besides the sharks. That's the problem. The bill will accomplish its purpose. It will catch the sharks and make it easier to stop the sharks. But the problem is that if you're not a shark, you could still get caught up in this net. And believe me, Mr. Speaker, if any of us gets caught up in this net by accident, it will be a nightmare. Because the time and the expense and the anxiety that will be involved in vindicating yourself will be more than most people can bear. Let me explain why it is that it would be a nightmare for anybody who's not involved in criminal activity but who does get caught up in this net. First of all, Mr. Speaker, the forfeiture to the Crown is not just of things that have been used in a crime, it's things that are likely to be used in a crime. And so, for the first time that I can remember, Mr. Speaker, this legislature has a bill before it that proposes punishing people not for what they have done, but for what they might do. And up until now, this has been the territory of the movies, like the movie Minority Report with Tom Cruise, where the government is able to look into people's brains to decide what crimes they are about to commit and then stops them, Mr. Speaker. So this is getting into movie territory here. It is not crimes that have been committed only, but crimes that may be committed in the future. Second of all, the unlawful activity that this bill is aimed at is not criminal offenses. It is any offense against any statute, provincial or federal. Any offense against any statute. Now, it would be a lot easier to understand, Mr. Speaker, if the unlawful activity that the bill talks about is a criminal code offense or a controlled substances legislation offense, those kinds of things. But it is any offense against any statute, provincial or federal. Third, Mr. Speaker, this bill is fully retroactive, which is something that this legislature hardly ever does. It reaches into the past and deems the law to have been different than it was at the time. So this bill doesn't only capture crimes that will be committed in the future or likely to be committed in the future, it says it applies in the past as well. It applies to any crime that was committed or is likely to be committed in the past and deems the law to have been different. And that is a highly unusual thing to do in any circumstance, never mind in a bill that puts together all these worrisome features. Fourth, Mr. Speaker, it is not necessary that any criminal charge ever be laid. So someone can have their property seized and forfeited to the Crown on the grounds that there's been or is likely to be unlawful activity, but no charge is required. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the bill stipulates that even if there is an acquittal, that is irrelevant, that the property can be forfeited to the Crown even if a person has been charged and has been acquitted. Fifth, Mr. Speaker, this bill operates on the balance of probabilities, not on the criminal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. And the best illustration of the difference between the two is the O.J. Simpson case, of course, where Mr. Simpson was acquitted of 2 murders on the criminal standard, which is beyond a reasonable doubt, but he was found liable on the civil standard, which is a balance of probabilities. And I know some people find that hard to understand, how you could be found innocent as far as the criminal courts are concerned and guilty as far as the civil courts are concerned. But the fundamental difference between the two, of course, is the standard of proof. One is beyond a reasonable doubt, and the other one is the balance of probabilities. So even though in this bill we're after people who are accused or are suspected of unlawful activity, it's the civil standard that's being applied, which is whether it's more likely than not. So now you don't have to be guilty of a crime. You don't even have to have committed a crime. It just has to be more likely than not that you have or that you might be guilty of a crime. That's pretty scary, Mr. Speaker. There are some safeguards in the bill designed to protect innocent people, but what of course the bill leaves out, as do most discussions about the justice system, is that you may have rights under the law, Mr. Speaker, but it can take a great deal of time, a great deal of money, and a great deal of anxiety to vindicate the rights. So let me give you a practical example. Let's suppose that there is a criminal, and he lives at home with his mother, and they have joint ownership of the house. Now, this criminal could be into any kind of thing. It could be something like fraud. It could be anything, really. But it doesn't really matter. But let's suppose that then this criminal is caught up in the net of the Civil Forfeiture Act. Well, what's going to happen is that that house will be frozen. The mother, who is a completely innocent party, has no idea what her son is up to, has no involvement with at all, will suddenly find her interest in the property frozen. And in order to protect her interest in the property, she's going to have to hire a lawyer, go to court, and prove to the court that she had no involvement in the son's criminal activity. And in the meantime, she will not be able to deal with her interest in the property. She won't be able to sell the house. She won't be able to mortgage the house. She won't be able to rent the house because it will have been frozen, Mr. Speaker. And if anybody in this House thinks that's a far-fetched scenario, Mr. Speaker, I assure them it is not. That is the kind of thing that this bill will do. It will sweep up innocent people in the net, and they will find themselves having to vindicate themselves before the courts to prove that they were not involved in the crime. It will sweep up family members. It will sweep up business partners. It will sweep up anybody who is in any way connected with the criminal. And there's going to be a great deal of hardship caused as a result of this legislation, a great deal of hardship to innocent people. Mr. Speaker, another worrisome feature of the bill is that the whole forfeiture scheme is initiated by somebody who is appointed by the Minister of Justice. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know a lot of politicians. I consort with politicians on a regular basis. Some of my best friends, Mr. Speaker, are politicians. But, Mr. Speaker, I don't want a politician in charge of this kind of wide-open forfeiture scheme. I just don't. And, Mr. Speaker, that is why in this province, in Nova Scotia, we have an independent director of public prosecutions, because history has shown that politicians cannot be trusted with the important function of prosecutions. Mr. Speaker, just ask Donald Marshall. And it was the Donald Marshall inquiry that recommended that the Minister of Justice be removed from day-to-day control of the prosecution service. That is why we have a Public Prosecutions Act, to establish and maintain the independence of the people who prosecute people in the criminal courts. And in this case, we're proposing a civil forfeiture bill which goes far beyond the powers of the prosecution service, far beyond the powers of the prosecution service, and yet the proposal is that that be under the direction of the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, perhaps the government will consider amending the bill so that this the person who is initiating these forfeiture proceedings will report to the Director of Public Prosecutions. That would be a positive step, because then at least we would be assured that there was some independence from the day-to-day political work of the province. But instead, the person who's in charge of these forfeiture proceedings is an appointee of the minister and reports to the minister, and the bill says, or Bill 14, which is the twin bill, the companion bill, says that the manager of assets can delegate his or her responsibilities to anybody, which opens the door to privatization or contracting out or outsourcing. And so this person with absolutely extraordinary legal powers could be a private corporation bidding for the contract, or it could be a civil servant reporting to the minister. Is that really right when we know from history that politicians can't be trusted to direct the prosecution service, that we want to give the Minister of Justice back even broader powers? I don't think so, Mr. Speaker. It's not clear also, Mr. Speaker, from the bill where the money will go. All this money that's forfeited to the Crown is a very important question. In the American jurisdictions that have legislation like this, this has become the crucial issue, because in many of those jurisdictions, the money goes to the police departments. And there are many examples in the United States of this power being abused, because, of course, when the police have the power to seize assets, then they have an interest in seizing as much as possible, because the more they seize, the bigger their budgets. Now, In Manitoba, for example, which has similar, not identical legislation, but similar legislation, they have avoided this problem that I've been outlining. They do it in two ways. First of all, Mr. Speaker, they don't have a civil servant doing the forfeitures. The people who apply for the forfeitures are the chiefs of police. Okay, Mr. Speaker, they are people who are well-versed and well-trained in the criminal law, so there's a direct connection between the criminal law and the civil forfeiture. The applications to the court are made by the police chiefs, and of course the police chiefs are independent of the day-to-day political operations of the province or of the municipality concerned. But the other thing they do in Manitoba, Mr. Speaker, is it stipulates that all of the proceeds go to support victims of crime. All of the proceeds. All of the proceeds go to support victims of crime because that removes any incentive that police departments might have to seize more than they should. Because it doesn't go then to their budgets. It goes to the victims of crime. So I would, Mr. Speaker, commend to the government's attention this model that's been adopted in Manitoba. If we must have legislation like this in order to try to suppress criminal activity, and as I said, we agree with this in principle, then let's get it right. Let's get the details right. Now, I have to assume, Mr. Speaker, that the government is aware of what's being done in other provinces in Canada. They would be aware of what's being done in Manitoba, so it must have been a deliberate choice on this government's part not to follow the Manitoba legislation. Why has this government chosen to put these extraordinary powers in the hands of an appointee of the Minister of Justice instead of in the hands of police chiefs, or instead of the hands of the Director of Public Prosecutions? That's where it belongs. Why has this government deliberately chosen not to have the proceeds directed exclusively to victims of crime? Why is it that Bill 14, which is the companion piece to Bill 11, says that it can go to victims of crime, but it can also go to law enforcement, it can go to defray the expenses of law enforcement, it can go to the police departments, and it can go to anything else the government deems. Heck, Mr. Speaker, it can go into the general revenues of the government. In Manitoba, they say it goes to one thing and one thing only, it goes to victims of crime. And, Mr. Speaker, it seems like a very good idea to us that that should be the case. There is another impact of this bill, Mr. Speaker, and we have to be careful about that in this House. Sometimes when we jump on the wagon train of popular opinion, Mr. Speaker, we don't sometimes realize that bills that we propose or pass in this House end up in the real world having the opposite effect of what's intended. And this could very well be one of these bills, Mr. Speaker, because remember, what this is likely to do is it's going to lead to fewer people pleading guilty. Because it stipulates that if you plead guilty to an offense, it is conclusive proof that you have committed the crime, and therefore you remove the burden, any burden of proof on the government to seize your assets. So once the criminals know that there is this great big hammer waiting in the background to hit anybody who pleads guilty, well, you know what the natural implication is. Fewer people are going to plead guilty. And that is particularly true in the complex cases that take so long and take up so much of the prosecution services resources. I'm thinking in particular, Mr. Speaker, of the fraud trials, because fraud investigations, as we know from many examples, take years typically. They're very complex, very labor-intensive, very paper-intensive. The trials can take months. It takes an enormous amount of resources from the investigation system, from the prosecution system, resources that could be better spent elsewhere within the system. And one of the things that saves us all is the fact that there is an incentive for the criminals to plead guilty. But what this bill will do will take away that incentive, or take away a large amount of that incentive, Mr. Speaker, and it's something that we just have to take into account. Now, when lawyers are advising their clients about whether to plead guilty or not plead guilty, they're going to have to take this bill into account. And more lawyers will be advising their clients not to plead guilty. Fewer of the criminals, particularly in the complex cases, will want to plead guilty. So, Mr. Speaker, that is our concern in a nutshell. These are the things that will work their way through the courts. Mr. Chatterjee, who I referred to earlier, was probably not the best case for a constitutional challenge because, frankly, he elicited no sympathy from the court or from anybody else. He had no reasonable explanation of where he got the money or why it smelled so strongly of marijuana. He had no explanation for why he had the equipment used for hydroponic growing operations in the trunk of his car. He couldn't explain any of this, and yet he was the one who challenged the constitutionality of these provisions. Mr. Speaker, so Mr. Chatterjee's circumstances probably were influenced the Ontario courts in which way they were going to come down and whether this legislation was constitutional or not. But what's going to happen in the future in Nova Scotia and elsewhere is other people, other innocent people, are going to come forward and they're going to challenge this legislation because they will have been caught up in the net. They will have been caught up in the net of the Civil Forfeiture Act, and they will have had their assets seized or frozen, sometimes for years. Their lives will have been ruined, and they will have done nothing. They will have done nothing wrong, but they still fit in with the terms of this extraordinarily broad act. Because, you know, Mr. Speaker, the fact is that the world is not divided up into, the good people and the bad people, the white hats and the black hats, the evildoers and the good people, Mr. Speaker. The world is a lot more complicated than that. There are many, many more shades of gray. Mr. Speaker, even if you're not a shark, you might know a shark. You might hang around sharks. You might have seen sharks. You might find yourselves in the company of sharks by accident. You might be related to a shark, but you haven't done anything wrong yourself, Mr. Speaker. And so if anybody who opposes this legislation will probably be accused of being pro-shark. But that's not what I'm saying at all. This bill will catch the sharks, and that's a good thing. And that's why we're going to support the bill in principle. The problem is an awful lot of people who aren't sharks are going to get caught up in this extraordinarily broad piece of legislation. And so, Mr. Speaker, as we go forward, what we will say to the government is this. The bill is good in principle, but let's talk about how to make it better. And some of the practical ways to make it better are to have the person initiating these proceedings independent of the Minister of Justice. Let's have that person report to the Director of Public Prosecutions, or let's follow the Manitoba model and say that it is the chiefs of police who will initiate these forfeiture proceedings, Mr. Speaker. The other suggestion that we have to make this bill better is to stipulate that the goods and property that are forfeited to the Crown will go exclusively to support the victims of crime, because then there can be no suggestion of any ulterior motives on anybody's part, which is what is so controversial in the American jurisdictions that have similar legislation. So those are my thoughts on the bill, Mr. Speaker. Those are the amendments that we will be taking forward to the government as this bill moves through. And we earnestly and sincerely ask the government to take those suggestions as they're intended as positive, constructive ways to make really an extraordinary bill a little bit better. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Justice Critic for the Liberal Caucus, I'm pleased to rise and make a number of comments regarding Bill number 11, the Civil Forfeiture Act, and its accompanying piece of legislation, Bill number 14, which is the Assets Management and Disposition Act. Mr. Speaker, the bills go together in essence. While they are presented as two separate bills, Bill number 11 first is the legislative arm of this new program, whereas Bill number 14 is more the administrative side of how this new program would be administered. Mr. Speaker, as has been mentioned by the member from Halifax Fairview, this is a significant piece of legislation in that it allows the government to take action against an individual who may not have been found guilty of a crime, and in fact, in some cases, may never have even been charged with a crime. Mr. Speaker, our entire justice system is on the basis of innocence until proven guilty, and that is the foundation that we have used in our province since its inception. To now be moving to legislation which says that the Crown has the ability to seek punishment against you in seizing some of your assets or some of your belongings without ever having found you guilty, or as mentioned, in some case without you ever having been charged, is quite a significant departure from our traditional justice principles here in the province of Nova Scotia. But as has been mentioned, Mr. Speaker, we are not the first province to adopt this type of legislation. This exists in British Columbia, Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Quebec, and Manitoba. And Mr. Speaker, it's important once again with other pieces of legislation which has been brought forward that we once again be mindful of the fact that this is reactionary legislation. This is after the fact legislation that the government is bringing forward, very similar to the legislation we saw last evening, which dealt with the gunshot and stab wounds reporting bill. The crime is already taking place when the government is bringing legislation to try to deal with the issue of crime, and we would once again reiterate our concern that the government needs to focus on crime prevention rather than dealing with once crime has already taken place. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of Bill number 11 is to create a mechanism to seize, hold, and sell property acquired or used in an illegal activity. As I've mentioned, other provinces do have this legislation, but I do note that in British Columbia, for example, civil liberties groups have attacked the legislation as an infringement of rights, and obviously that legislation is starting to have difficulty in that province. But similar to other provinces, the legislation that's being proposed here in our province, Mr. Speaker, does not require any conviction or actual proof that criminal activity has taken place. I also note, Mr. Speaker, that this legislation does exist in the United States, Australia, Ireland, United Kingdom as well. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, the Bill number 14, which will be coming up next, is the actual administrative arm which will allow government to be able to administer this act. And the Assets Management and Disposition Act is going to create the body or person who will manage the property and accounts created under the Civil Forfeiture Act. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned last night with the gunshot and stab wounds bill, we need to make sure that this bill is actually achieving what the government says it wants it to achieve. The government keeps saying this is a bill meant to get at criminals. As I believe the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal said in introducing the bill, it's intended to show that crime doesn't pay. As was mentioned by the member from Halifax Fairview, and as I mentioned last night with the gunshot and stab wounds bill, we need to make sure that innocent Nova Scotians aren't suddenly being made the victims of suspicion here in our province. I was concerned with the bill last night that innocent people may suddenly have the police showing up and questioning them as to whether they were part of criminal activity, whereas they were simply innocent individuals showing up at our hospitals or medical facilities. The question is here again, will innocent Nova Scotians somehow fall under the suspicion of the government, and even though they have never been charged with anything, even though they've never been found guilty of any criminal activity, they could still find themselves having to deal with the suspicion of government. Mr. Speaker, when I was first briefed on this bill by representatives of the Department of Justice, the first thing that came to my mind when I heard about this bill in civil forfeiture, I said, this is the government coming in with the seizing John's cars again. Now, we know they've tried it twice, and it's failed in this House, and when I saw this, I said, here's the third kick of the can. So suspected Johns will once again the government's looking for the ability to be able to seize their vehicles. And that's the question. Will this bill allow the government to do such a thing? And maybe the Minister of Justice will be able to clarify that in his comments, either at the end of second reading or when the bill comes back from law amendments. And we as well, Mr. Speaker, will be supporting this bill going into law amendments because we're curious to hear from Nova Scotians as to what their views are on this. I'm curious to hear what the Nova Scotia Bar Society and different members of the bar and different individuals involved with civil liberties have to say about this legislation. Once again, there is no one in this House of Assembly or Nova Scotia that doesn't want to see our province take a hardline stance on criminal activity. More importantly, I think they want to see us take a hardline stance on criminal prevention, which we've yet to see during this sitting. It is all reactionary, as I've mentioned before. But do we have the safeguards in this legislation which allows us to be able to say, as elected representatives, that innocent Nova Scotians are not going to become the victims of government and suddenly be put under suspicion? I believe, as the member from Halifax Fairview did mention, the unfortunate innocent Nova Scotians that could fall under the suspicion are in for great misery. And that is not what the bill is supposed to do if we are to believe exactly what the government has told us. There is a tremendous amount of regulatory power in this bill as well, along with so many other pieces of legislation we have seen from this government. We are once again being asked to give our approval to a concept and to an approach which at the end of the day, this House will have absolutely no control as to what the final product will look like, because Cabinet will go back, they will meet behind closed doors, and they will determine what the regulations are going to be. Mr. Speaker, that again is of great concern to me. One of the issues, Mr. Speaker, as well, which was brought to our attention in reviewing the bill, is the fact that there's a 10-year limit on this legislation, that from the time there's a suspected criminal activity, 10 years later, the government can take action. Now, Mr. Speaker, one of our concerns is that 10 years is a long period of time to talk about assets and to talk about property. What will this bill do for the individual who buys a piece of property in good faith, has done the necessary checks to make sure that they have good title, only to find out later that the government's going to come and try to seize it because they're alleging that it may have been from proceeds of crime, or it may have been as a result of illegal criminal activity. Or illegal activity, I should say, because as has been pointed out, it doesn't necessarily have to be criminal as long as it violates a provincial or federal statute. So, Speaker, 10 years is a long time, and again, we question whether innocent Nova Scotians who've bought property in good faith are suddenly going to have that property seized through no fault of their own, but through the activities of another disinterested party. Speaker, I did note the comments that were made by the member from Halifax Fairview as to who will administer this specific piece of legislation and who will be the manager of assets management. Mr. Speaker, I did take note of his comments, and I have no issues with the suggestion that he has made. If this truly is meant to be an element of dealing with criminal activity and illegal activity here in this province, let's put it in the hands of a clearly impartial party. I note that the member from Halifax Fairview suggested that the reporting take place to possibly to the Director of Public Prosecutions. What he did not mention, though, was who should make that appointment and start off with. And maybe that's something that we should discuss further as to how can we give the message to Nova Scotians that the individual who will be responsible for this program, not only are we making sure that they are reporting to an impartial body, but who is going to be responsible for determining who that individual might be. And that might be something that we can look further and strengthen in the legislation so that there is no political interference in the system and that Nova Scotians can have a sense of confidence that this is clearly a power that the government is not going to try to use at will, that the individual who will be responsible will be impartial, will be clearly qualified to undertake this new responsibilities, but will clearly understand that this is a significant infringement on rights here in our province and should only be used when the case has clearly been made. and to go outside of our regular justice principles of innocence until proven guilty is a significant departure for us here in our province, and something which should not be used lightly. During the briefings and during the discussions, the minister has said that this is for high-end criminals, that this is where the focus was going to be, and that in Ontario they've dealt with the really high-end criminals, that this has not been down to the smaller criminals, or that innocent people haven't been being caught up in this. Only time will tell, Mr. Speaker, and I question whether the legislation provides the necessary protections to ensure that will take place. Mr. Speaker, I did note as well the comments from the member from Halifax Fairview about strengthening exactly where the proceeds from this legislation should go. And I tend to agree that it should go to the victims of crime. But let's make sure that we put the right safeguards in doing that, because you will recall, Mr. Speaker, a few years ago, when it's this same government that got caught taking the victim impact fee, which is imposed on people found guilty in our court system, and that money, which was supposed to be set aside for victims, this government had found a way to put its hands on it and spend it somewhere else. And once they got caught, they had to stop doing it. We need to make sure, if we're going to make that amendment, that we put the safeguards in to make sure that if it's supposed to go to victims, that is exactly where it goes, and that government doesn't have the ability to divert that money to other areas or to other pet projects. And so that is, again, an amendment that we'd certainly be more than interested in discussing further. Mr. Speaker, again, being that this legislation does exist in other jurisdictions, I'm at a loss as to why the government continually fails to bring forward a regulatory package when they're introducing these bills. If this was the first time this was ever tried in the province, then I could understand where they say we need some time to put forward the regulations. We are the 5th or 6th province to adopt this. Why the government cannot at least show the opposition, here's the regulatory package we intend to use, here's the full package for you to see and for you to go over. I'm at a loss to understand why that happens and why we continue to allow it to happen. I guess we need to accept responsibility as an opposition that we've not forced them more on that. But, Mr. Speaker, I think it's time, with this bill and with so many other bills, that when we're simply catching up to other provinces, let's see the entire package. Let's not get caught with Cabinet making decisions on regulations which does not meet exactly the spirit of what was discussed here in this House of Assembly. There's one way to avoid that suspicion that we have: show us the regulations up front. This is a bill where this could have been done, and I'm at a loss to understand why the government is not doing it. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I do hope the government will take its time in calling this bill to law amendments. I do hope that both the Nova Scotia Bar Society and other interested parties will be coming forward to present us their views on this bill and any possible changes that could be made as a result. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will end my comments and look forward to seeing this bill move through second reading. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize the honourable member for Halifax-Shabukto.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I want to put on record several concerns about this extraordinary piece of legislation. As indicated by my colleague, the member for Halifax Fairview, indeed we will support the bill at second reading, but primarily for the purpose of allowing more time for discussion and hearing what submissions we will get at law amendments, and to try to take the opportunity to talk with the government about the ways in which it might refine its intentions over this bill. Let's start by observing at large that this is an extraordinary intrusion by government into private property. Mr. Speaker, I have heard the Premier make comments recently in this House and outside the House, as it happens, directed at our party and perhaps in some measure at me personally, suggesting that we have no respect for the private sector and for business. I want to assure the Premier and all members of this House that, in fact, we are quite prepared to work with the private sector in the appropriate realm, and indeed, we have great respect for the institution of private property. Private property is historically one of the main bulwarks that individuals have against any chance of abuse of powers by the state. I believe so strongly in private property, I think everyone should have a lot of it. But it seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that this bill has to be seen in the context of being an extraordinary potential intrusion on private property. And if that's going to be the case, first, I'm surprised that this government brings it forward. But second, we have to be very careful, very measured, very targeted if steps are going to be taken along those lines. So let me start by looking at what it is that this bill purports to do. This bill purports to allow the possibilities of forfeiture of private property in three distinct sets of circumstances. The first is when it comes to offenses that are federal offenses. The second is when it comes to provincial offenses. And the third is when it comes to anticipated offenses. Now, we've already heard the criticism about anticipated offenses. That just seems to me so dubious a proposition that some extraordinary justification would have to be brought forward before one could consent to that. So let's look at the other two aspects of it. Let's look at first the proposal that for any federal offense and for any provincial offense, there could be forfeiture of associated property. Let's start first by thinking about federal offenses. There is already, as has been noted, a provision in the Federal Criminal Code that allows for forfeiture of property associated with certain crimes. I emphasize that it's associated with certain crimes only. It's not all federal offenses, because of course there is a huge amount of federal legislation that sets up penalties of one sort or another for violation of one statute or another. But this is essentially a criminal code matter dealt with by the federal parliament under Part 12.2 of the Federal Criminal Code, where they have taken a very focused view of when it is that property associated with the commission of a crime, not any federal offense, but a crime, and particular crimes, can be invoked. And it's not all criminal code offenses even. It's indictable offenses and it's drug offenses. And those are the crimes that the federal parliament, in its wisdom, which has prime jurisdiction over criminal matters, has decided that forfeiture is appropriate. They took a targeted approach when they looked at the whole of the panoply of federal offenses. They didn't make it forfeiture for all federal offenses. What this bill purports to do is to say, let's go one better than the federal government with respect to federal offenses. Let's take all federal offenses and expose malefactors and associated people to the possibility of seizure of their property. Why should we do that? Why should we take it upon ourselves to go beyond what it is that the federal government has decided should be a narrow, restricted, carefully used, carefully structured power? Why should we go beyond that? And I want to remind the members opposite that there are a huge number of federal offenses, many of them regulatory. Is it the case that when there's a violation of the Federal Fisheries Act, as, for example, an environmental offense of dumping deleterious materials into water frequented by fish, which sometimes happens in forestry operations, that this government believes that a bulldozer or a feller buncher should automatically be subject to forfeiture by the person who might have committed that offense, on top of the fine or other penalty that they're exposed to under the Federal Fisheries Act? If that's what they believe, they ought to explicitly stand up and say to the forestry workers, to the owners of woodlots in this province, that that's what they're standing up for, that they are saying that a $300,000, $500,000 feller buncher is going to be forfeit to the Crown because they might have put some debris into a creek. Well, I'm not in favor of violations of the Federal Fisheries Act. Of course not. People should be stopped. There should be stop work orders. There should be penalties. There should be prosecutions. And if there are, then people will be fined. Judges will make decisions about what the appropriate penalty is. But this government wants to expose people to the possibility of much more severe offences. Mr. Speaker, I understand one of my colleagues wishes to make an introduction. I will yield for a moment.
On introduction, the honourable member for Dartmouth South Portland Valley.
Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my colleague allowing his response to be interrupted. I'd like to introduce a class from Dartmouth High School, and Donald Hewell is their teacher, and I'm very pleased to welcome them here. They're sitting in the West Gallery, and I ask them to stand and be recognized by the House of Assembly.
Thank you. The honourable member for Halifax-Chebucto.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you. Again, I want to be clear that the federal government has already chosen the appropriate range of federal offences for which forfeiture of property associated with the commission of crimes ought to be available as a step in the process. And if we're being invited to go beyond that, we have to be given a very good reason, and we have to be told which particular offences the government has in mind. So far, all this legislation tells us is that it's all federal offences. All federal offences. Now, that's an extraordinarily large number of potential activities for which property forfeiture could come into play. Now, on the face of it, I find this implausible as good public policy. We also have to ask ourselves whether it would survive charter scrutiny. My colleague, the member for Halifax-Fairview, pointed out that there was a decision this year by the Ontario Court of Appeal in the case of Chatterjee. And in that decision, the Ontario Court of Appeal deflected the constitutionally based attack on the Ontario equivalent or similar piece of legislation. But there was a reservation in the decision. The Ontario Court of Appeal said something in the middle of that decision which it would be as well for us to note, because if this government is assuming that its bill will survive a constitutional attack, that is far from clear. All the Chatterjee case says, although this is important for the validity of this kind of legislation, is that when it comes to division of powers under the Constitution, there can be a plausible reason for the province to enact legislation like the bill in front of us. That is a plausible constitutional law reason. But let me read to you paragraph 36 of the judgment of the court. We note finally that no issue arises on the facts of this case as to any conflict between the CRA and federal legislation such as the Criminal Code's forfeiture provisions. Accordingly, we leave for another day the question of the application and operation of the federal paramountcy doctrine to resolve any such conflicts. What that means is that it is still open for litigants, for those who might lose their property, to challenge our legislation or similar legislation on paramountcy grounds. That would have to do with a conflict between the operation of the federal and provincial legislation. Essentially, it's predictable that we are buying ourselves a lawsuit if this goes forward. Probably it's predictable that some such lawsuit will arise elsewhere in the country. do we wish to get involved in that? I'm suggesting that if there is the possibility of a conflict, that this bill should be examined with that question in mind. When I look at it, I worry about that. The next aspect has to do with the provision in the bill that essentially says that property can be forfeited for any provincial offense. And the same objection arises. The same point has to be made. The ambit of provincial offenses is very wide. Many of them have to do, for example, with the regulation of professions. Many of them have to do with environmental issues. To take a similar example, if there is an offense committed under the Provincial Environment Act, is all property associated with that offense going to be forfeit in addition to the fine and other penalty assessed by a judge in that case? Is it the case that if a pulp and paper plant or any other business commits an effluent offense, that all of a sudden the whole of that plant is going to be forfeit to the province? Is it the case that any business that commits an environmental offense, by putting out into the environment at large a pollutant, will find itself no longer the owner of its land and buildings and equipment? That's a fine state of affairs. Is it the case that perhaps someone practicing a profession who violates the regulatory rules of that profession as set out in provincial legislation is not only going to be disciplined by their professional body, not only perhaps fined, but in fact, is their office and their office equipment going to be seized and sold? And what if this person is a professional who works from home? Is their home in which their family lives elsewhere going to be seized and sold? This is my point, Mr. Speaker, that this is way too broad as legislation. This legislation has the potential to intrude on private property in ways that this government does not seem to have contemplated. The consequences of this are potentially enormous. And I think the government has simply not thought it through. They have simply not asked themselves, what is the worst case scenario? That's a sensible question to ask yourself when you're bringing forward a piece of legislation like this. You say to yourself, what's the worst that could happen to people under this law? Well, let me assure you, Mr. Speaker, and assure the members opposite, that citizens at large are going to be asking themselves, what is the worst that could happen? We recently heard a case in the newspaper in which a gentleman who took a bulldozer and opened up a path through protected area part of the province in order to reach his hunting camp was stopped by provincial officials. Now, if that person has committed an offense, as I believe they probably have under provincial legislation, is their bulldozer going to be subject to be seized? Sounds like it under this bill. Now, I think it's reasonable that the government should take steps to stop someone who's doing that. They should post notices, they should put up barriers, they should tell the person they can't do it, they should, in fact, prosecute if that's appropriate, and when in due course the matter comes in front of a judge, the judge will assign some kind of penalty, perhaps a fine, perhaps something else, but they're not going to seize and sell the bulldozer. That would only arise if the person couldn't pay the fine. That would be an adjunct, a follow-on. And it wouldn't have to be the bulldozer, it would be something else, but this proposed statute draws a direct connection between the commission of a provincial offense and the property used, the private property used in the commission. Now, the government may decide that that's its policy, but if so, it had better stand up and let Nova Scotians know in no uncertain terms exactly the way they intend to potentially intrude into their ownership of private property and all the many ways in which the Nova Scotians will stand exposed to this extraordinary measure. Now, let me point out two other features. It's already been noted that this bill is linked with Bill 14. Bill 14 is a companion piece of legislation that sets up an administrative mechanism to move forward with this. It talks about who's going to administer it. It talks about what might happen to the funds. And it's already been noted that in the United States, that law enforcement agencies are able to benefit directly from the seizure of assets in these circumstances. This is a very poor public policy. It has been widely criticized in the United States. It has been alleged that there are any number of abuses, and it's obvious that if a local law enforcement agency is going to be able to benefit directly and exclusively from the forfeiture of property in these circumstances, that they are going to be very tempted to use the law in full measure and with very little exercise of discretion, because they've become an interested party. The legislation in the United States, and so far as I can see, these bills invite the police not to be disinterested, not to be neutral upholders of the law, but to become an interested party in the outcome. That is not the traditional conception of justice that has formed the foundation for how we structure our police forces and the administration of justice. That is wrong. It should simply not occur. It is also the case that it is possible for the Crown to move explicitly to recover its costs in the proceedings. And I've looked at the Ontario regulations under their equivalent act, and believe me, the numbers of dollars as a percentage of assets seized is quite extraordinarily high as allowed for in the regulations under the Ontario Act. I wouldn't want to see that in place here. I'm not convinced that, in fact, there should be a specific provision that allows for recovery of costs in the same way as if this were a civil trial in which the Crown were involved. That, I think, is not the model. Costs of the Crown should probably simply be borne out of general revenues, not set up with the kind of table that we see in the Ontario regulations. Mr. Speaker, I suggested that when this bill moves ahead to the law amendments stage, we would have the opportunity to hear public input. I hope there is public input, but it seems to me that there's also an alternative. This seems to me exactly the kind of legislation or set of ideas represented by legislation that ought to go forward to the Law Commission for examination. This is the kind of proposal that should be sent out for a thoroughgoing inspection by those whose job it is to think about the law and public policy. So I would commend that final thought to the government when it rethinks, as I hope it will, what it is that it's going to do with this bill number 11 and the associated bill number 14. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much.
I'll recognize the Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal to close debate on Bill number 11.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the members opposite for their comments, and I'm sure that the Minister and his department will take those into consideration. And I now would move a second reading of Bill number 11. Thank you.
Thank you. The question has been called for second reading on Bill number 11. Is the House ready for the question? Question has been called. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried.
Bill 11, entitled An Act Respecting Civil Forfeiture of Property.
Order that this bill be referred to Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable, the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 14, Assets Management and Disposition Act?
Bill number 14, Assets Management and Dispositions Act. The Acting Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and on behalf of the Minister of Justice, I'm pleased to rise and speak about Bill number 14, the Assets Management and Disposition Act. This act will allow the province to manage and dispose of assets forfeited to the province under either the criminal code process or the civil forfeiture process. Also, Mr. Speaker, this act will ensure that the illicit profits of criminal activity are funneled back into the community through crime prevention initiatives. To implement this act, the Department of Justice will establish a Proceeds of Crime unit which will investigate and seize proceeds of crime through court order. Taking the profit out of these crimes will send a strong message that crime doesn't pay in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, this legislation will create a new source of funding for crime prevention activities. Taken together with the Civil Forfeiture Act, these pieces of legislation send a strong message to criminals that they are not welcome in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the support of the other parties with regards to these important amendments, and on that, I move second reading of Bill number 14.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bill number 14 is a companion piece to Bill number 11. They really belong together. They're twins. They're two sides of the same coin, as it were. So I certainly don't need to repeat the comments that I made with respect to Bill 11. I will point out, though, Mr. Speaker, that this is the bill that gives the Minister of Justice the authority to appoint this manager of assets, who is a person who would actually initiate forfeiture proceedings. So this is the bill that we will propose to amend, so that it's not the Minister of Justice making the appointment, but rather the Director of Public Prosecutions, or, Mr. Speaker, to stipulate that these forfeiture proceedings will be brought by chiefs of police and not by a civil servant. I would also like to point out, Mr. Speaker, that it is this bill, Bill 14, that stipulates where the money goes. And just for the benefit of the House, I'd like to list where the money can go. It can go, according to Section 5 of the bill, to expenses and costs incurred in administering the Act, quite reasonable. You can defray the cost of the forfeiture proceedings out of the proceeds. Second, compensation of eligible victims. C, prevention of criminal or unlawful activities. D, remediation of the effect of criminal or unlawful activities. E, law enforcement. And F, other purposes prescribed by the regulation. So, Mr. Speaker, although it permits the money to go to victims of crime, it doesn't require it. In fact, because of the last provision, saying that it's whatever purposes are set up by regulation, the money can go anywhere. The money can go into general revenue, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to point out to the government a fact that I know that it is already aware of, and that is that in other jurisdictions that have this kind of legislation, they specifically prohibit the money being used for law enforcement. And they do that, Mr. Speaker, in order to avoid the precise problem that is established, proven in the United States, that when you give a police department the money that results from these seizures, they have an incentive to seize as much as possible. The more they seize, the bigger their budget. And that has led, Mr. Speaker, to predictable abuses in the United States. And that's why some of the Canadian legislation prohibits, specifically prohibits, the money gained by forfeiture from being used for that purpose. And we just have to assume that because the government is aware that that's what other legislation says, that they have made a deliberate choice to include that in the legislation. In our view, Mr. Speaker, the money gained from the sale of criminal assets should not go into general government revenue. It should not be used to increase the budgets of the police departments that seize the assets. It should go to victims of crime, and exclusively to victims of crime, and for support services for victims of crime, just as is done in Manitoba and other Canadian provinces, Mr. Speaker. So it is this bill that we will be proposing to amend as the bill goes through the legislative process. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I'll recognize the Honourable the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal to close debate on Bill number 14.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for his comments. And with that, I'll move second reading of Bill number 14.
The question has been asked. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Against? Motion carried.
14, entitled an act respecting provincial assets, management, and disposition.
Or that this bill be referred to Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 15, Small Claims Court Act?
Bill number 15, the Honourable the Acting Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, on behalf of the Minister of Justice, I'm pleased to rise today on the second reading of Bill number 15, amendments to the Small Claims Court Act. The importance of Small Claims Court to the effective administration of justice in Nova Scotia cannot be overstated. Mr. Speaker, Small Claims Court provides a quick, informal, and cost-effective method for deciding claims. For example, it is not necessary for the participants to hire lawyers. Proceedings are less formal than in other courts, and cases are heard by adjudicators, not necessarily lawyers. Currently, Mr. Speaker, Small Claims Court can decide cases with claims of up to $25,000. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia Small Claims Court is admired across the country for the speed at which matters are heard. However, Mr. Speaker, we must ensure that our Small Claims Court remains effective and responsive to the needs of our citizens. That is why we're introducing amendments that will increase to $2,500 the amount that a plaintiff can claim for general damages. Currently, Mr. Speaker, a plaintiff in Small Claims Court cannot seek general damages of more than $100. In order for a plaintiff to claim more than $100 in general damages, the action must be commenced in Supreme Court. This places tremendous and unwanted burden on the plaintiffs in Small Claims Court. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the amendments introduced today give small claims adjudicators the discretion to consider expert reports, even if the experts in question are unavailable for cross-examination. To sum up, Mr. Speaker, the amendments introduced today are meant to streamline the Small Claims Court process here in Nova Scotia. In doing so, they will improve the court system and the effective administration of justice in our province. Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the support of other parties in relation to this bill, and on that, I move second reading of Bill number 15.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our justice critic has asked me to address these various pieces of justice legislation before the House today, so I'm pleased to rise again to address the Small Claims Court. Now, the Small Claims Court Act amendments. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have to say that I agree with the Minister of Justice that the Small Claims Court Act is an important part of the judicial system here in Nova Scotia and allows for the quick resolution of disputes. But I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that is far from being the whole story of Small Claims Court. Now, I have some experience in Small Claims Court. I was in there a couple of months ago on behalf of a client on a residential, on behalf of a constituent on a residential tenancies matter. sorry, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of a constituent on a residential tenancies matter, and I'm glad to say that we were successful. But the reality of the Small Claims Court, Mr. Speaker, is considerably different than one would suspect from the remarks of the former Minister of Justice there, the Minister of Transportation. The Small Claims Court really is the Wild West of the Nova Scotia justice system, Mr. Speaker. It allows for quick resolution of claims, but you don't know who the witnesses are going to be, you don't know what they're going to say, you don't know what documents they're going to produce. You're going in blind and hoping things turn out for the best, and you hope that you're prepared for anything that might happen. And Mr. Speaker, if anybody thinks there's no lawyers in Small Claims Court, they're kidding themselves. They are absolutely kidding themselves, because when I was a young lawyer, or should I say a younger lawyer, when I was starting